In this video, I'll look at setting up the final rendering of the jungle scene. Now, as a word of caution here, plan to render your scene through a couple of times. I'll say it again. Plan to render your scene through a couple of times. There will be things that simply show up when you render that you just didn't see in a still test. So I usually allot that I will render through at least twice. The first just to catch all sorts of things I want to fix, and hopefully the second is final. Here are some things you can do to make sure this all works. First, click on the plus next to the viewport label of Camera 1 and choose Create Preview and Create Animated Sequence File. A preview here is a screen grab of every frame in the view and then stitched together in a movie. It runs at a percentage of the output, as we can see here in the image size. And you can put out whatever file you'd like, an AVI using whatever codec you have available, or a custom file type. For example, I'll browse out in custom file type as a QuickTime, and I'll make this run at full screen. In the beginning, you may want to output at 50%, but for the final test, run full size. So here's my 100% size, 1280 by 720, making sure it's over my active time segment, in this case for Camera 1, 0 to 143 frames. And what would I like to see? Well, yes geometry, yes particles, there's no bones so I don't have to worry about it. Do I want to see safe frames or frame numbers? Frame numbers are a good idea, and a camera name, that's up to you. I'm going to show it in realistic with textures but not edged faces, so it's as good looking as possible. When I hit Create, making sure it's rendering from Camera 1, it'll pull up this dialog, Create the Animated Sequence, and I'll name this Cam 1 Test. In here then, I can configure whatever file type I'd like. Here's a QuickTime movie, for example, and I'll hit Save. This will pull up the standard QuickTime dialog, and I'll use MPEG-4 video. I'll run it at 24 frames per second at best quality and click OK. You can choose another format if you'd like, but what we're seeing here is it's starting to preview and capture each one, letting the lighting settle and capturing that frame. My preview is done, and I'm going to pull up that QuickTime movie and take a look. I browsed over to my Jungle project, and in there is a directory named Previews. Your preview should go automatically in here, although it depends where you clicked on to save it. When I go into Previews though, here's my QuickTime movie, and I'll double click on it to pull it up. I'll play it and press Ctrl-L to loop. This way I can see as it buffers to the RAM if there's any issues. It looks pretty good. There's some minor flying things around. I see a couple of them pass close by, and looks pretty good otherwise. I could play with the particles more or tweak the lighting and rendering. I have one plant here that's a little bit submerged in the ground I should probably fix, but I like the way it's coming out. So I'm ready to set up the render. The other things I'll do in here are put any lights I need under any other plants. So we can see here in a top view, in a wireframe for example, I've got some of my bounce lights in. And if I pick the camera and go to the Motion tab and go to Trajectories, I can see its path. What we're seeing here then is the camera is going to zip along between these plants, as I knew when I animated it. So it's a good idea to start taking my bounce lights here and positioning them in that camera view, maybe in a top starting out and under plants here, instancing them as I need and pulling them along, making sure that all the leaves I see are correctly underlit. In my camera view then, Camera 1, I can see that this leaf I just placed a light under should have pretty good bounce light. I'll make sure I pick that light and slide it down, just down to the jungle floor. We can do this all through from the camera view, and this is an important idea, making sure that when we're setting up things, we do it from that camera view. By the way, if you move a camera slightly like I am here in the view to get over and place a light better, don't panic. If you scrub down here on the timeline, the camera snaps back on to the animation you had made. The key is to find where that camera is, including the interpolation, so even though I moved it, it goes back to the right place. When I'm ready to render, I'll click on the Render Setup, and I'll set my files up here for a sequence. First, under Indirect Illumination, I'm going to drop down here where it says Project Final Gather Points and choose Along Camera Path. In here, I can choose the number of segments I've got depending on the interpolation I'd like. The default is 9, but I'm going to run 4 for a little faster render. This will calculate the final gather along that camera path, which in this case is fairly straight, going forward and backward from where the camera is. That way it blends the final gather together, meaning that instead of possibly generating splotches every frame, it'll have a more uniform final gather. I'll also kick up the precision to low, and I'll see how this looks. Over here in the Common tab, I'll check the size, make sure it's set to View, and that I'm rendering the active time segment, in this case 144 frames. If you're running a shorter range, choose Range and put the frame number in. I'll scroll down and into the Render Output section, and I'll click on the Files button. This browses out to the Render Output, and I can see I've got the wrong project set here. I'll make sure it's going to the right project in the right folder. I'm here in my Jungle project in the Render Output, and as you can see I've got some tests I had run before. For this run, I'm going to put it out as a QuickTime movie. Alternately, if you're going to take it out to a compositing program such as Autodesk Composite or another post-effects and compositing application, you may want to put out an image sequence. We could put out, for example, Targas, or if you'd like to dabble in EXRs, which have more color depth, but they are of greater file size. For now though, I'll run this as a QuickTime and name this file. I'll call it JungleCam1. And I'll click on Setup. And in that QuickTime Setup, again, I can choose my output file. If you're just rendering a movie out of Max, that's perfectly fine. But if you'd like to do a sequence for post, choose one of the other formats, and the help has great documentation on it. I'll select it, hit Save, and when I'm ready, hit Render. It's important when you go to hit Render to make sure you've assigned all the textures, you've tested the lighting, you've tested the animation, you've previewed it, you've checked your settings, you've checked your anti-aliasing in the rendering. Looks like I'm a little low there and I should switch to 1. I also want to make sure that the file's going in the right place. All the textures are there. Nothing's showing up black. I've decided how I'm handling the background, which in this case is going to be my daylight system. All these things factor in. When I'm all ready though, I'll hit Render and pull up the files.